After her husband died, his parents cruelly took her home, leaving her with nothing. But the Black Widow's next move stunned everyone. Don't forget to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sunlight spilled through the lace curtains of the cozy living room, where a faint aroma of brewed coffee lingered. The house, though modest in size, was filled with memories and tokens of a life well lived. Every corner whispered a story, a shared laugh, or a tender moment. For Alice, this house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was her sanctuary, the place where she and John had built their life together. As Alice sat on the couch, her fingers lightly traced the edge of an old photo frame resting on the coffee table. Inside it was a picture of her and John on their wedding day. Her deep brown skin glowed against the soft white lace of her dress. John stood beside her, his arms wrapped protectively around her waist, his pale blue eyes filled with pride and love. They both wore radiant smiles, a defiant declaration against the judgmental stares they had endured. Alice closed her eyes, letting the memories pull her back to the beginning. Their story had started unexpectedly at a bustling charity event in the heart of the city. Alice had volunteered as part of an outreach program for underprivileged children, helping to organize the event. She'd been busy arranging chairs and directing volunteers when she noticed him, a tall, fair-skinned man with a warm smile that lit up the room. John had come as a sponsor for the event, but instead of mingling with the other donors, he had spent his time helping Alice carry boxes of supplies. By the end of the evening, they had exchanged numbers. Their connection had been instant, as if they'd known each other in another life. Over the weeks and months that followed, they discovered shared interests, a love for soulful music, a passion for social justice, and a dream of creating a home filled with warmth and kindness. John adored Alice's sharp wit and compassionate heart, while she admired his unyielding optimism and courage to challenge societal norms. But not everyone saw their love through the same lens. John's family, a prominent white family from a conservative suburb, had been anything but supportive. Alice remembered the first time she met them vividly. His mother, Mary, had greeted her with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes, while his father, Richard, offered only a curt nod. The atmosphere had been cold, and Alice felt every bit of the judgment radiating from their stony gazes. It didn't take long for their disdain to manifest in words. Mary would comment on Alice's hair, her background, and even the way she spoke, all under the guise of polite conversation. Richard's disapproval was quieter but no less cutting. He would dismiss Alice's opinions at the dinner table, talking over her as if she weren't there. The worst, however, was John's brother, Dan. Unlike their parents, Dan didn't bother to veil his racism. He would openly mock Alice, making crude jokes and referring to her as John's experiment. The family gatherings became a minefield, each visit leaving Alice drained and questioning whether their love was worth the constant battle. John, however, stood firm. He defended Alice at every turn, challenging his family's prejudices and refusing to tolerate their behavior. "If you can't respect her, you can't respect me," he'd said during one particularly heated argument. It was a line in the sand, one that pushed his relationship with his family to the brink. Their wedding was the culmination of their defiance. It had been a small ceremony attended by close friends and a handful of Alice's relatives. John's family had boycotted the event, claiming it was a mistake they wouldn't endorse. Standing at the altar under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights, Alice and John promised to love and protect each other against all odds. It was the happiest day of her life. The years that followed were a blend of joy and challenges. They bought the little house in the suburbs where they spent countless evenings cooking together, dancing in the kitchen to their favorite Motown records, and dreaming about the future. They had talked about starting a family, but life always seemed to get in the way. Instead, they poured their energy into their community, volunteering and supporting causes they believed in. But even within their haven, the shadow of John's family loomed. Mary and Richard would occasionally call, not to reconnect, but to berate John for his choices. Dan, meanwhile, took to social media, spewing hateful remarks about their marriage. Yet, through it all, John and Alice held on to each other, their bond growing stronger with each challenge. Then came the day that changed everything. It had started with subtle signs. John complaining of fatigue, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Alice had brushed it off as stress or a cold, but as the symptoms worsened, she convinced him to see a doctor. The diagnosis hit them like a freight train: late-stage cancer. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable slicing through her like a blade. In the months that followed, their lives became a whirlwind of hospital visits, treatments, and sleepless nights. Alice took on extra shifts at work to cover the mountain medical bills, all while caring for John and maintaining their home. Her once lively and strong husband grew weaker with each passing day, his spirit still fighting even as his body failed him. Through it all, John remained her rock. He'd hold her hand and tell her stories, his voice steady even when the pain was unbearable. "You're my strength," he'd say, his eyes filled with love. Alice would smile through her tears, refusing to let him see how much her heart was breaking. As Alice opened her eyes and placed the photo frame back on the table, she took a deep breath. The house was quiet now, almost too quiet. But it was still hers, a reminder of the life and love she and John had shared. Whatever came next, she knew she had to honor his memory, to protect the sanctuary they had built together. The hospital room was cold, sterile, and filled with the faint hum of machines monitoring John's every breath. Alice sat beside his bed, her fingers gently brushing against his pale, trembling hand. The once vibrant man who had danced with her in their kitchen, his laughter filling the air, was now a shadow of himself. His skin was pallid, stretched thin over his cheekbones, and his blue eyes, once so full of life, now seemed dulled by the weight of his illness. John's diagnosis had come 6 months earlier, and every day since had been a battle. Chemotherapy, radiation, endless tests, none of it seemed to halt the cancer's relentless march. Alice had quickly adapted to her new role, juggling her shifts as a nurse with being John's full-time caregiver. Her days were a whirlwind of preparing meals, administering medications, and sitting through hours of treatments. She rarely had time to rest, but she refused to complain. Her love for John gave her the strength to endure it all. John, however, was growing more and more worried, not for himself, but for her. One evening, as Alice carefully adjusted his blanket, he reached out and placed a frail hand on hers. "You've done enough, Alice," he murmured, his voice weak but firm. "You're running yourself into the ground." Alice shook her head, blinking back tears. "I'm not going anywhere, John. You're my husband. Taking care of you is what I'm meant to do." He tried to smile, though it came out as more of a grimace. "I know, but you can't do it all. Promise me you'll rest." Alice didn't reply. Instead, she leaned over and kissed his forehead, her tears falling silently onto his skin. As the days stretched into weeks, John's family remained conspicuously absent. Mary and Richard had visited once early on, their presence more performative than supportive. They'd sat stiffly in the room, their eyes darting uncomfortably to the machines surrounding John. Mary had made a passing comment about how tired Alice looked, her tone dripping with passive aggression, while Richard had barely spoken at all. After that visit, they hadn't returned, though Mary occasionally called to ask about John's condition. Each call ended with a thinly veiled question about his financial affairs. Dan, as expected, was worse. His absence was absolute, save for the occasional inflammatory post online about how tragic it was to watch John throw his life away. John had long since stopped caring about his brother's opinions, but Alice could see the pain etched into his face every time his family's indifference came up. Despite their absence, John had one pressing concern: ensuring Alice's future. Late one night, as the city outside the hospital hummed with life, John asked Alice to sit down. His voice was barely above a whisper, but his tone was resolute. "Alice, we need to talk about the house," he began, his gaze fixed on her. She frowned. "The house? John, I don't want to talk about that right now." "We have to," he insisted. "I don't trust them. You know they'll come for it when I'm gone." Alice's chest tightened at his words. She hated when he spoke as though his death were inevitable, even though she knew deep down that it was. Still, she nodded, recognizing the urgency in his voice. John explained his plan to transfer the house and all his assets into her name. "I've already spoken to the lawyer," he said. "Everything will be finalized before I'm discharged. That way, they can't touch anything." Alice wanted to protest, to tell him that none of it mattered as long as they had each other, but she knew better. This was his way of protecting her, of ensuring that she could keep the life they had built together. So she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, whatever you think is best." In the days that followed, John grew weaker, his body no longer able to endure the strain of his illness. Alice spent every waking moment by his side, reading to him, holding his hand, and whispering words of love and comfort. She barely slept, afraid that if she closed her eyes for too long, she might miss his last breath. Then, one quiet afternoon, John turned to her with a faint smile. "Alice," he said, his voice trembling, "how much time do you think we've spent together?" She blinked, startled by the question. 15 years, she replied, "not nearly enough." He chuckled weakly. "It feels like both a lifetime and a moment." Alice's throat tightened, and she fought back the tears threatening to spill. "Stop," she pleaded. "Don't talk like that." But John shook his head. "We have to face it, Alice. I don't have much time left." For the first time since his diagnosis, Alice felt the full weight of her grief crash over her. She buried her face in his chest, her sobs muffled against the thin fabric of his hospital gown. John wrapped his arms around her as best he could, his own tears falling silently into her hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I promise to never make you cry." Alice shook her head, pulling back to look into his eyes. "Don't you dare apologize. You've given me more love and happiness than I ever thought possible." In the days that followed, John made one final request. "I want to go home," he told Alice. "I don't want to spend my last moments in this hospital." Alice hesitated. She knew the risks of taking him home, but she also knew how much it meant to him. After speaking with his doctor, they arranged for his discharge. Alice made sure everything was ready. His favorite chair set up by the window, soft blankets on the couch, and all his medications organized neatly in the living room. When John returned home, it was as though a weight had lifted from his shoulders. He spent his final days surrounded by the warmth of their shared life, with Alice by his side every step of the way. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, John took Alice's hand in his. "Promise me one thing," he said, his voice barely audible. "Anything," she replied. "Keep talking to me, every day, even when I'm gone. I'll hear you." Alice nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise." John passed away the next morning, his hand still clasped in hers. The house, once filled with the sound of his laughter, now felt unbearably quiet. But even in her grief, Alice held on to his final words, vowing to honor the life they had built together. The house was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against Alice's chest like a physical weight. The air felt heavy, saturated with the absence of John's laughter, his voice, and the small familiar sounds of his daily routines. Even the furniture seemed to mourn, the well-worn armchair by the window sitting empty, its cushion slightly sunken where John used to rest. Alice sat at the dining table, staring blankly at the stack of papers in front of her. Death certificates, medical bills, and the finalized will John had meticulously prepared to protect her. The reality of his passing was starting to set in, yet it felt impossible to accept. Just days ago, his hand had been warm in hers. Now that warmth was gone, leaving only the memory of it to cling to. The funeral arrangements had fallen entirely on Alice. John's family, unsurprisingly, had offered no help. Mary, his mother, had called once, not to console Alice, but to criticize her for choosing what she deemed a too modest ceremony. "John deserved something grand," she'd said in a tone dripping with condescension, as though Alice wasn't already giving her all to ensure he was honored. The funeral was held on a cool autumn afternoon in a small chapel, one that John had loved for its simple beauty. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues filled the pews, their presence a testament to the man John had been, kind, generous, and deeply loved. Alice sat in the front row, her hands clutching a white rose, her heart heavy with grief but grateful for the support of those who truly cared. Toward the back of the chapel, John's family arrived late, their presence more a performance than a genuine act of mourning. Mary wore a dark, expensive suit and carried herself with an air of superiority, while Richard's expression was as stoic as ever. Dan, as expected, didn't bother hiding his disdain. He leaned against the wall with crossed arms, his eyes scanning the room with a sneer. During the eulogy, Alice spoke of John's kindness, his love for life, and his unwavering belief in justice. Her voice trembled but didn't break, even as tears streaked her face. She ended her speech with a promise to honor John's memory by continuing to live the way he had taught her, with courage, love, and integrity. After the service, people gathered outside the chapel to offer their condolences. Alice was surrounded by friends and neighbors, their words a balm to her aching heart. But amidst the warmth of their support, the icy presence of John's family loomed in the background. Mary approached her as the crowd began to thin, her face fixed in a mask of forced civility. "It was a fine service," she said, her tone implying otherwise, "though I must say it lacked the grandeur John would have wanted." Alice stiffened, but kept her voice steady. John didn't care for grandeur. He cared for authenticity. This is what he would have wanted. Mary's lips tightened, but she said nothing more. Instead, she looked past Alice, her gaze settling on the modest car parked nearby. "It's a shame he didn't leave more behind," she muttered under her breath before walking away. Dan, however, was less subtle. As he passed Alice, he muttered loudly enough for others to hear, "Shame about the house. Won't be hers for long." Alice froze, her mind racing. What did he mean? She turned to confront him, but he had already disappeared into the crowd. Her stomach churned with unease, the weight of his words lingering like a dark cloud. Back at home that evening, Alice sat alone in the quiet living room. The day's events replayed in her mind, each interaction with John's family gnawing at her peace. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were planning something, that their disdain for her wasn't just rooted in prejudice but also in greed. Her fears were confirmed a week later. She was sorting through John's belongings, carefully packing away his clothes and personal items when the doorbell rang. Opening the door, Alice was met with the sight of Mary, Richard, and Dan, each carrying bags as though they intended to stay. Mary pushed past Alice without waiting for an invitation. "We've decided to move in," she announced, her tone making it clear she saw no room for argument. John would have wanted his family here. Alice blocked the doorway, her heart pounding. "This is my home," she said firmly. "John left it to me." Dan smirked, pulling a folded document from his pocket. "Not according to this," he said, waving the paper in her face. "John's will says the house belongs to his family, so you'll have to pack up and go." Alice's stomach dropped as she stared at the paper. It looked like John's handwriting, but something about it felt off. Her mind raced as Mary and Richard began to make themselves comfortable, setting their bags down in the living room. "I'll call the police if you don't leave," Alice said, her voice trembling with anger. Mary laughed, a cold, dismissive sound. "Go ahead," she said, "but I doubt they'll side with you once they see this." She gestured to the document Dan was holding. Alice knew she couldn't let them intimidate her. Steeling herself, she forced her voice to remain calm. "This isn't over," she said, "and you're not staying here." The family reluctantly left, their departure filled with threats and smug remarks. As soon as the door closed, Alice locked it and sank into a chair, her hands shaking. She knew she needed help, and she knew exactly who to call. That night, Alice contacted the lawyer John had worked with to finalize his will. Explaining the situation, she arranged a meeting to review the documents and prepare for the battle she now knew was coming. Whatever it took, she would honor John's memory and protect the home they had built together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the living room floor as Alice paced back and forth, clutching the phone in her hand. Her conversation with John's lawyer, Mr. Miller, the night before, had been both reassuring and unsettling. The will she held, signed and notarized, left no doubt that John had transferred the house and all his assets to her. Yet, the audacity of his family, barging in with a falsified document, sent a chill down her spine. This was no longer just a battle of words. It was a fight for her home, her dignity, and John's memory. Alice spent the rest of the morning gathering every piece of evidence she could find. She pulled out the finalized will, legal documents from the lawyer's office, and even emails between John and Mr. Miller discussing the transfer of ownership. She carefully placed them in a folder, her determination growing stronger with every page she touched. John had trusted her to protect their home, and she wouldn't let him down. Her preparation was interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Alice froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the clock. It wasn't even noon. Taking a deep breath, she approached the door and opened it cautiously. Standing on her porch were Mary, Richard, and Dan, their expressions a mixture of smugness and hostility. "We've come to settle this," Mary declared, her voice icy. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped forward, but Alice blocked her path. "This is not your home," Alice said firmly, her voice unwavering despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. John left it to me, and I have the documents to prove it. Dan smirked and held up the same paper he'd waved at her during their last encounter. And we've got this, John's real will. So unless you want this to get ugly, I'd suggest you pack your things. Alice crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. That document is fake, and you know it. You're not stepping foot in this house. Richard, who had been silent until now, took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Alice. You're outnumbered here, he said coldly. You can't win this. Alice's stomach churned, but she refused to let her fear show. Then I'll call the police and let them handle it. Mary scoffed, her face twisting in disdain. You really think the police will take your side over ours? Look at you. Her eyes flicked over Alice with barely concealed contempt, her tone dripping with the unspoken racism that had tainted every interaction since the day they met. The words stung, but Alice stood her ground. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice steady, and I'm not going anywhere. Before the confrontation could escalate further, Alice's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw Mr. Miller's name. Relief washed over her as she answered. Mr. Miller, she said, her voice shaking slightly. They're here. Stay calm, Alice, he replied. I'm on my way. Don't let them in and don't engage any further. I'll handle this. Alice nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Thank you. When she hung up, she turned back to the family. My lawyer is on his way. If you want to make this legal, we'll do it the right way, but until then, you're not coming inside. Mary's face twisted in frustration, and she muttered something under her breath, but she didn't argue. Richard and Dan exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard by Alice's resolve. After a tense moment, they retreated to their car, but not before Dan pointed a finger at Alice. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and threatening. As they drove away, Alice leaned against the door frame, her hands trembling. She didn't feel victorious, yet. She knew this was just the beginning, but she also knew she wasn't alone. With Mr. Miller by her side, she had a fighting chance. Later that afternoon, Mr. Miller arrived at the house. A man in his late 40s with sharp features and an air of calm authority, he greeted Alice with a reassuring smile. Let's take a look at what they brought, he said, setting his briefcase down on the dining table. Alice handed him the document Dan had left behind, and he studied it carefully. Within moments, he shook his head. It's poorly done, he said. The signature doesn't match John's, and there are no witnesses or notary seal. This won't hold up in court. Relief flooded through Alice, but it was quickly tempered by anger. How could they stoop so low? She asked, her voice trembling. John was their son, their brother, and now they're trying to erase everything he did for me. Mr. Miller nodded solemnly. It's despicable, but unfortunately not uncommon in cases like this. People reveal their true colors when inheritance is involved. They spent the next few hours reviewing her documents and preparing for the next steps. Mr. Miller assured her that her case was solid and that any attempt by John's family to challenge the will would likely fail. Still, he advised her to be cautious. They're not going to give up easily, he warned, but neither should you. The following days were a blur of preparations. Alice notified the police of the harassment and ensured that her property was secure. Mr. Miller filed a formal response to the family's claims, attaching the valid will and evidence of the fraudulent document. The legal process had begun, and Alice braced herself for the fight ahead. But even as she prepared for battle, A part of her grieved. This was not what John would have wanted. He had always hoped that one day his family might change, that they might see Alice for who she truly was and not the color of her skin. Now, his absence had only deepened the divide. On the night before the first court hearing, Alice sat in the quiet living room, a framed photo of John in her hands. "I won't let them take this from us," she whispered. "I'll protect what we built together. I promise." The room remained silent, but in her heart she felt his presence, steady and unwavering. It was enough to give her strength for what was to come. The courtroom loomed on the horizon, and every day leading up to the hearing felt like a step toward a battlefield. Alice knew this fight wasn't just about the house. It was about her dignity, her love for John, and her right to the life they had built together. She could feel the weight of his memory in every corner of their home, and it fueled her resolve. The first step was gathering evidence. With Mr. Miller's guidance, Alice dove into the daunting task of assembling every piece of documentation she could find. She started with the most important item: John's finalized will. It was safely stored in her lawyer's office, a legally binding document with clear instructions to transfer all of John's assets to her. The signatures, notary seal, and witness statements made it airtight. Mr. Miller assured her that it was her strongest weapon, but Alice knew she needed more. In John's desk, she found a folder containing emails and handwritten notes he'd exchanged with Mr. Miller during the process of drafting the will. The notes were filled with John's heartfelt intentions, detailing why he wanted Alice to inherit everything. "She's my wife, my partner, my everything," he'd written. "This house belongs to her as much as it does to me." As Alice read those words, her heart ached with both grief and gratitude. John had always thought ahead, always cared for her even when his body was failing. She carefully placed the notes in the folder, knowing they would help prove his wishes in court. Next, Alice turned to financial records. She sifted through bank statements, mortgage documents, and utility bills, all of which showed that she and John had shared the responsibilities of the house equally. The records painted a clear picture of their life together, one built on mutual support and love. These documents, Alice hoped, would help counter any arguments from John's family that she was somehow undeserving of the inheritance. Her search also uncovered something unexpected: a small, portable USB drive tucked away in the back of John's drawer. Plugging it into her laptop, Alice discovered that it contained scanned copies of additional legal documents, along with personal letters John had written but never shared. In one, he addressed his family directly. "To my family, I know you may never understand my choices, but they were mine to make. Alice has been my rock, my greatest love, and my closest confidant. If you can't find it in your hearts to respect her, at least respect my wishes. This house is hers, and I hope you'll let her live in peace." The letter brought Alice to tears. It was a stark reminder of how deeply John had cared for her, even in the face of his family's cruelty. She printed a copy to present in court, knowing it would carry weight as evidence of his intentions. As Alice prepared her case, she reached out to John's closest friends and colleagues. Many of them had witnessed his unwavering devotion to her and were willing to provide statements or testify if needed. One of John's former co-workers, a kind man named Victor, recounted a conversation they'd had shortly after John finalized his will. "John told me he wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of," Victor said over the phone. "He said you'd sacrifice so much for him, and it was the least he could do." Victor's words filled Alice with renewed determination. She asked him to write a statement detailing their conversation, which he agreed to do without hesitation. Meanwhile, Mr. Miller worked tirelessly to build a robust legal strategy. He reviewed the fraudulent will that Dan had presented and found glaring inconsistencies. The handwriting didn't match John's, the signature was sloppy, and there were no witnesses or notary seal. To strengthen their case, Mr. Miller arranged for a handwriting expert to analyze the document and provide a formal assessment. The expert's report confirmed what they already knew. The will was fake. Despite the mounting evidence in her favor, Alice couldn't shake the feeling of unease. John's family wasn't just greedy, they were vindictive. Over the weeks leading up to the hearing, she received several anonymous letters in the mail. Each one contained veiled threats, suggesting that she'd regret challenging them in court. The letters didn't scare her as much as they angered her. They were a reminder of the prejudice and hatred she'd faced throughout her marriage, and she was determined not to let it defeat her now. Alice brought the letters to Mr. Miller, who added them to the case file. "This is harassment," he said. "We can address this in court as well. It only strengthens your position." In the midst of all the chaos, Alice found moments of solace. Her neighbors, who had always been supportive of her and John, stopped by regularly to check on her. One evening, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman from across the street, brought over a homemade pie and sat with Alice in the living room. "I just want you to know," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice gentle but firm. "The whole neighborhood is behind you. We all loved John, and we all see what you're going through. If you need anything, you just let us know." Alice thanked her, grateful for the kindness that balanced out the ugliness she was facing. It was a reminder that not everyone in the world was like John's family, that there were still people who valued fairness and compassion. As the hearing date drew closer, Alice spent her nights sitting in the quiet of the living room, surrounded by folders of evidence and the comforting presence of John's photograph. She often found herself talking to him as she had promised she would. "I'm scared, John," she admitted one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have the truth on my side, but they're so cruel. They'll do anything to hurt me, even if it means dishonoring you." She paused, staring at the photo. In it, John's smile was bright and unguarded, a reflection of the love he'd always shown her. "But I won't let them win," she continued. "I'll fight for us, for everything we built together." The house was silent, but Alice felt a quiet strength rise within her. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew she wasn't facing it alone. John's love was still with her, guiding her every step of the way. And with that love, she was ready to face whatever came next. The courthouse loomed like a fortress against the clear morning sky. Its cold, gray exterior mirrored the tension Alice felt as she approached the entrance, clutching a leather-bound folder filled with the evidence she and Mr. Miller had painstakingly gathered. Her steps were steady, but inside, her stomach churned with a mix of nerves and determination. This wasn't just about proving her legal right to the house. It was about standing her ground against years of prejudice and injustice. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, some curious locals, others friends and neighbors who had come to support Alice. On one side of the room sat Mary, Richard, and Dan, their expressions ranging from smug confidence to barely concealed disdain. Alice couldn't ignore the way Mary's gaze lingered on her, filled with the same judgment and contempt she had endured since the day she'd met her. On Alice's side of the courtroom, Mr. Miller sat beside her, his demeanor calm and professional. "Remember," he said in a low voice, "we have the truth on our side. stay composed, and let the evidence speak for itself." Alice nodded, drawing a deep breath as the judge entered the room and called the court to order. The proceedings began with Mary's lawyer presenting the fraudulent will. Alice watched as he held it up, describing it as a document that clearly reflects John's intentions. The lawyer argued that it was signed during John's illness and that it demonstrated his desire to leave the house to his family. Mary nodded along, her face a mask of righteous indignation, while Dan smirked in Alice's direction. When it was Mr. Miller's turn, he approached the bench with quiet confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "we have substantial evidence to prove that this document is a forgery and that my client, Alice Thompson, is the rightful owner of the property in question." He presented John's valid will, pointing out the signature, notary seal, and witness statements that made it legally binding. He then introduced the handwriting expert who took the stand and testified that the signature on the fraudulent will did not match John's authentic handwriting. The expert explained the analysis in detail, leaving no room for doubt. As the testimony unfolded, Alice stole a glance at Mary and Dan. Their smug expressions had begun to falter, replaced by unease. Mary whispered something to their lawyer, who looked increasingly tense. Next, Mr. Miller called Victor, John's former co-worker, to the stand. Victor recounted his conversation with John, in which John had expressed his wish to ensure Alice would be taken care of after his passing. "John loved Alice deeply," Victor said, his voice steady. "He wanted her to have the home they built together. He was very clear about that." The courtroom was silent as Victor's words hung in the air. Alice felt a surge of gratitude for his support, knowing how much it meant to have someone testify on her behalf. Then came the turning point. Mr. Miller introduced the USB drive Alice had found, containing John's personal letters and scanned documents. Among them was the letter John had written to his family, pleading for their understanding and asking them to respect his wishes. As the letter was read aloud, Alice saw the emotions ripple through the courtroom. Some of the spectators looked visibly moved, while others exchanged murmurs of disapproval directed at Mary and Dan. Even the judge's expression softened as the heartfelt words echoed in the chamber. Mary's lawyer attempted to argue that the letter was irrelevant, but Mr. Miller countered. This letter not only demonstrates John's clear intentions, but also highlights the strained relationship between him and his family, which gives further context to his decision to leave everything to Alice. Finally, Mr. Miller addressed the harassment Alice had endured in the weeks leading up to the trial. He presented the anonymous letters and argued that they were part of a broader pattern of intimidation by John's family. Though Mary and Dan denied any involvement, their lawyers' protests sounded hollow in light of the overwhelming evidence against them. When it was Mary's turn to testify, her performance was both dramatic and desperate. She painted herself as a grieving mother, claiming that John had been manipulated into changing his will. "He wasn't in his right mind," she said, her voice quivering. "He was sick and vulnerable." But Mr. Miller was prepared. He presented medical records and testimony from John's doctors, confirming that John had been of sound mind when he signed the will. The contradictions in Mary's testimony became glaringly obvious, and her credibility crumbled under cross-examination. Dan, called to testify next, was even less composed. His arrogance and short temper got the better of him, and, under Mr. Miller's questioning, he inadvertently admitted to being present when the fraudulent will was created. "We were just trying to make things right," he blurted out before realizing the gravity of his words. By the end of the hearing, the evidence was clear. Alice's ownership of the house was indisputable, and the judge wasted no time delivering the verdict. In light of the evidence presented, the court finds that the will submitted by the plaintiffs is fraudulent and has no legal standing. The property in question rightfully belongs to Alice Thompson, as stated in the valid will prepared and signed by John Thompson. A wave of relief washed over Alice as the words sank in. She had won. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and though Mary and Dan protested, their voices were drowned out by the sound of the gavel striking wood. Outside the courthouse, Alice was greeted by her friends and neighbors who had come to show their support. Hugs and congratulations surrounded her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Mary, Richard, and Dan exited the courthouse in silence, their faces pale and drawn. They avoided Alice's gaze as they walked past, their defeat unmistakable. For all their bluster and cruelty, they had been exposed for what they truly were. That evening, back at the house, Alice stood in the living room, the sun casting a warm glow through the windows. She looked at John's photograph on the mantel, her heart full of gratitude and love. "We did it, John," she said softly. "I kept my promise." The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It was hers, a symbol of everything she and John had built together. And now it was safe. The courtroom victory was a turning point for Alice, but it wasn't the end of the story. The verdict had not only affirmed her rightful ownership of the house, but also set in motion a cascade of consequences for John's family. Their defeat in court had stripped them of their smug confidence, leaving them exposed to the legal and financial repercussions of their actions. The court ordered Mary, Richard, and Dan to pay $30,000 in damages for their attempts to defraud Alice and their harassment leading up to the trial. The sum was substantial, and the family's finances were not nearly as robust as they had pretended. They had put on airs of wealth and privilege, but the truth was far less flattering. Years of poor financial decisions and mismanagement had left them on shaky ground. Dan was the first to crumble under the pressure. Known for his brash arrogance, he now faced a reality he couldn't bully his way out of. Forced to liquidate assets to cover his share of the damages, he sold his car and a collection of high-end electronics he had often flaunted as symbols of success. His social media, once filled with pictures of extravagant outings and luxury purchases, went silent. The people who had cheered him on in his online tirades against Alice were nowhere to be found when his fortunes took a turn. Mary and Richard, meanwhile, were faced with the loss of their home. Unable to afford the damages and their mounting debts, they sold their house, a stately suburban property they had lived in for decades, and moved into a cramped apartment on the outskirts of town. The move was a humbling experience for Mary, who had always prided herself on maintaining appearances. The once pristine image of their family was now irreparably tarnished, and she avoided the few remaining social circles she had left. For Rita, Dan's wife, the fallout was a breaking point. The stress of the trial and the financial strain took a toll on their already strained marriage. Arguments became a daily occurrence, and within months of the verdict, Rita packed up her belongings and left, taking their 2 young children with her. Dan's isolation deepened, and the realization of what his actions had cost him finally began to sink in. Alice heard bits and pieces of these developments through the grapevine. Neighbors and mutual acquaintances occasionally shared updates, though she never asked for them. It wasn't out of vindictiveness that she listened, but rather a sense of closure. Their downfall wasn't something she celebrated, but it was a reminder of the consequences of their cruelty and greed. Despite the financial penalties and the humiliation of their public defeat, John's family showed no signs of remorse. Mary continued to blame Alice, accusing her of manipulating the system and stealing what she believed was rightfully theirs. She made no attempt to apologize, and neither did Richard or Dan. Their bitterness was evident, but Alice chose not to let it affect her. She had fought her battle and won, and their opinions no longer had any power over her. In the months that followed, Alice focused on rebuilding her life. The house, once a battleground, became a place of peace and healing. She repainted the living room walls, repaired the creaky floorboards in the hallway, and planted new flowers in the garden John had loved so much. Each small project was a step toward reclaiming the space and making it her own. Her neighbors remained a constant source of support. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman from across the street, frequently stopped by with baked goods and words of encouragement. "You've been through so much, dear," she'd say, placing a comforting hand on Alice's shoulder, "but you've come out stronger." Alice's colleagues at work also rallied around her. They marveled at her resilience and often told her how much they admired her strength. "You've inspired us all," one co-worker said during a lunch break. "You stood up for yourself and for what was right, even when it felt impossible." But perhaps the most meaningful moment of healing came when Alice revisited John's favorite park, a quiet spot by the lake where they had spent countless afternoons. She brought a bouquet of wildflowers sitting on the bench where they used to talk for hours. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, she spoke to him. "I've done what you asked, John," she said softly. "I protected our home. I didn't let them take it. But more than that, I found peace. I know you'd want me to live, not just survive. And I will." The breeze rustled the leaves around her, carrying with it a sense of calm. For the first time in a long while, Alice felt truly at ease. Back at the house that evening, Alice stood in the doorway, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. The house was no longer just a reminder of the battles she'd fought. It was a symbol of her strength, her love for John, and the future she was building for herself. As for John's family, they receded into the background, their presence in her life reduced to a distant memory. Alice chose to forgive them, not for their sake, but for her own. She didn't need their apologies or their approval. What mattered was that she had honored John's legacy and protected the life they had built together. And with that, she turned the page, ready to write the next chapter of her story. The house stood quiet in the morning light, its white-painted walls glowing softly as the sun crept higher in the sky. Alice stood by the kitchen counter, a cup of tea in her hands, savoring the warmth that spread through her fingers. It had been nearly a year since the court case, but the memories of that difficult time were now like a distant echo, softened by the peace she had worked so hard to cultivate. Her days were no longer dominated by fear or legal battles. Instead, she filled her time with small but meaningful rituals. Each morning, she tended to the garden John had loved so dearly, carefully watering the flowers they had planted together. The garden had flourished under her care, a vibrant mix of colors that seemed to carry his presence. The scent of blooming lavender and jasmine filled the air, and the sound of birdsong brought a sense of calm that Alice cherished. After her morning routine, Alice often sat in the living room where John's photograph rested on the mantel. It was a simple portrait, his smile bright and unguarded, the way she wanted to remember him. As she sipped her tea, she spoke to him, just as she had promised. "Good morning, John," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "The garden's looking beautiful today, You'd be proud of it. I finally got the roses to bloom." These conversations had become a cornerstone of her healing. Though she couldn't hear his responses, she felt his presence in the room, as though his love lingered in the walls of the home they had built together. Alice had also returned to her work at the local clinic, where she found solace in helping others. Her colleagues had been overjoyed to see her back, and many of the patients she cared for seemed to sense her kindness and resilience. One elderly woman, a regular at the clinic, had once grasped Alice's hand and said, "You have the most comforting smile, dear. It feels like a hug." The moment had brought tears to Alice's eyes, reminding her that even in her grief, she still had so much to offer. She began volunteering again at community centers, just as she and John had done in the early days of their marriage. Whether it was organizing food drives or mentoring young people, Alice found that giving back filled the empty spaces in her heart. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Inspired by her story and her resilience, a few of her neighbors suggested starting a community initiative in John's memory. The idea took root quickly, and soon Alice found herself leading the creation of the John Thompson Memorial Fund, a program aimed at supporting people facing discrimination and injustice. The fund provided financial aid, legal resources, and emotional support to those in need, ensuring that John's legacy lived on in a way that honored his values. The fund became a success almost overnight, thanks to Alice's tireless dedication and the community's enthusiasm. Donations poured in from people who had heard her story, many of them strangers who were moved by her determination. Local businesses offered their support, and even some of John's former colleagues reached out to contribute. It was a testament to the kind of man John had been, and the life he and Alice had built together. On the 1-year anniversary of the court victory, the community gathered in the park to celebrate the official launch of the Memorial Fund. Alice stood at the podium, her heart full as she addressed the crowd. "When John and I moved to this neighborhood, we dreamed of a life filled with love, kindness, and fairness," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We faced challenges, yes, but we also found incredible support from so many of you. This fund is a way to give back, to help others find strength in the face of adversity. I know John would be proud of what we're building together." The crowd erupted into applause, and Alice felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to feel hope, not just for herself, but for the future she was helping to create. As the event wound down and people began to disperse, Alice found a quiet moment to herself by the lake. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water, and she closed her eyes, letting the peaceful sounds of nature surround her. "I hope you can see this, John," she whispered. "I hope you know how much you're still loved." The wind picked up lightly, rustling the leaves in the trees, and Alice felt a familiar sense of calm wash over her. She took it as a sign, a reminder that John's presence would always be with her, no matter where life took her. Back at home that evening, Alice sat in the living room, surrounded by the quiet comfort of the house. The walls that had once felt too quiet now echoed with the warmth of new memories and possibilities. She opened her journal, a habit she had picked up during her healing journey, and began to write. "I've learned so much this year," she wrote, "about love, loss, and resilience, about the power of community and the strength we find in ourselves when we have no other choice. This house is more than just a building. It's a testament to what John and I shared, to the life we built together, and to the future I'm creating now." As the night deepened, Alice placed her pen down and glanced at John's photograph. "Good night, John. she said softly. "I'll see you in the morning." The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It was filled with love, hope, and the unshakable spirit of a woman who had faced the darkness and found her way to the light. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. If you enjoyed the video, share it with your friends and let us know your thoughts in the comments. And be sure to check out more of our videos. We'd love to have you along for the journey.